bulletin said this morning, we are transitioning out of our Family Talk series and into a new sermon series that we are calling Relationships. And it is focused on stories from the Bible that reveal important truths about our relationships with one another. And one of my favorite passages to share on this subject, one of my favorite passages to unpack, and that I've found to be so helpful in areas of apologetics and in counseling, especially counseling through conflict, is Numbers chapter 12. It's a story from the Old Testament, and most of us think it's one of the most boring books of the Old Testament because it's a whole lot of counting up people and numbering how many are in each tribe. But within the book, there are several really powerful, really interesting stories in Numbers chapter 12. Numbers, for those of you who maybe haven't been in that book in a while, Numbers is the fourth book of the Bible. And it takes place right at the end of Exodus when they get the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. Numbers is that transition out of Mount Sinai and journeying towards the Promised Land. That's what the book of Numbers covers. Now, in their journeys, the Israelites were no strangers to grumbling and to rebellions that rose up from among the people. Okay? There were many times as Israel ventured into the wilderness and they dealt with foreign enemies, and they dealt with the heat, they dealt with the eating manna every day while they're in the wilderness, and struggling with all of that and trying to wrestle that all together. Many times people would say, oh, you know what? Egypt wasn't this bad. Maybe we should just go back to Egypt. And then there were others who said, oh, you know what? We can do a better job. We should lead instead. And every time something like this happens in the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, God ultimately kills all the rebels. This is why when you're reading in the laws in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and some that are in Numbers, you'll see this phrase that repeats over and over again. You must purge the evil from among you. The idea was keep the camp pure. In Numbers 12, we have the first rebellion in Israel's history that comes from the top. The first time where leaders rebel against God's chosen and appointed leader. Let's look at the first 2 verses in Numbers chapter 12. Miriam and Aaron began to talk against Moses because of his Cushite wife, for he had married a Cushite. Has the Lord spoken only through Moses, they asked? Hasn't he also spoken through us? And the Lord heard this. Israel, at this time, had 3 major players in its leadership. Moses, the big guy, right? The guy who, let my people go. He's the number 1 guy. But then right underneath him is his siblings, Aaron and Miriam. Now, for those of us who only grew up with Sunday school or Hollywood renditions of the Exodus, we remember that Moses is the guy who's talking to the Pharaoh and leading the people, and he's doing all the stuff. But when you read your Bible and you look at the story of the Exodus, you find that it is actually not the case. That yes, Moses is a major player. But right off the bat, when God calls him to service, Moses says, I have a speech problem. I don't think I can handle this job. And so he convinces God, after a lot of whining, he convinces God to let Aaron, his brother, join him in the ministry and let Aaron be the mouthpiece. So when you're having these powerful scenes where Moses is dialoguing with the Pharaoh, in the biblical account, it's not Moses having a one-on-one. It's Moses kind of whispering to his brother to tell him this next. Because he was a scared guy and he had some insecurities. So Aaron was a big part of that. Miriam is his sister. And there's an interesting connection that I found in my studies this week with Miriam and Moses' story that I'll share a little bit later. But at this time, we've got Moses, Aaron, and Miriam that are all kind of running the show. But in Exodus 24, before Moses goes up the mountain to get the 10 Commandments, we're given an important distinction. In Exodus 24, God says that only Moses may go up the mountain. And he goes out of his way to say, even Aaron, even Miriam, they can't go up. I will only speak and I will only give the commandments to Moses. Everybody else stays down at the base of the mountain and goes nowhere near me. You can imagine, at least from Aaron's perspective, who's been doing all this mouthpiece work, wait, I don't even get to go up the mountain? I don't get to see the big guy? Only Moses gets to? But that's the rule. That's what God establishes in Exodus 24. And here in the opening verses, we see that now Aaron and Miriam's inner insecurities and their grumbling rises to the surface. And they begin to gossip about Moses amongst the Israelites. And essentially what they're getting at is, how come Moses gets all this extra attention? But, and this is important, if you're going to understand what this passage is about this morning, you need to realize what verse 1 says. A lot of times we have what I call verse 1-itis. We like to jump past verse 1 because in the New Testament a lot of times it's, dear friends, my name's Paul, I like to, hello, and then you're like, oh yeah, let's get into what he actually wants to talk about. Verse 1 is one of the most important verses in this story this morning, because verse 1 tells us that although they were mad about Moses' closeness with God, that's not the reason that they were telling people they had an issue with it. You see that? Did you catch that? Aaron and Miriam were grumbling to the people because of Moses' wife. Look at this wife that he chose, a Cushite. Cush is a region in Africa. They're saying, look at this African woman that he married. And that's their springboard to gossip about him. Even though that's not the real issue. Why wasn't this issue brought to Moses directly? Why did they start gossiping about it immediately? And is that really what the problem was? As we see what happens later in the story, is it really who his wife is the problem that they have with Moses? Today we're going to unpack Numbers 12 together, and we're going to look at what it has to tell us about conflict. And we're also going to see what it says with what we ought to do when we start to take issue with somebody. When we start to have a burning against someone, when we start to have a gripe with somebody, how are we supposed to carry those feelings? Especially in this story when it has to do with someone that's in authority in our lives. An authority figure or a religious leader. What do we do when we have these feelings of anger, jealousy, frustration, etc.? But before we continue into the next verses of our story, there are several red flags in just the first 2 verses that we need to address. The first one is that the very first word in both the Hebrew and the English Bible for this story is Miriam. That is weird. Now, I know in an American audience we would say, what's the big deal? Just Miriam and Aaron. But in Hebrew culture, you never mention the woman first. Always, when you see lists of family members, even if the ages are different, the men go first. We live in a male-dominated society in the Old Testament times. You don't mention the woman first for any reason. But here in Numbers 12, Miriam is constantly mentioned before Aaron. And the question is, why? The argument has been, is that especially as you watch the story play out, Aaron doesn't get a punishment at the end of the story. Only Miriam does. So the suggestion here, and Hebrew grammar seems to support this in the story, is that Miriam is the real instigator. That Aaron's kind of along for the ride, but Miriam is the one who really is bringing this to a head and bringing the issue out and doing all the gossiping and causing all the problems. Yes, Aaron is a part of it, and we're going to see that, but Miriam seems to be the primary antagonist in the story. But a second thing that I mentioned a couple minutes ago that I learned this week in my studies that I never knew before is that in rabbinic tradition, Miriam is associated with the unnamed sister that followed baby Moses down the river and watched after him. I never knew that, personally. I knew that a family member was kind of watching out and making sure that alligators and stuff didn't get baby Moses while he was floating down the river, but I never knew that was Miriam. Rabbis have taught that that was her, that she was watching and keeping Moses alive. And perhaps this is partly why she has such a gripe that she doesn't get the access that Moses does. I kept this little snot alive while he was a baby and I don't get to see God? What is that all about? He wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for me. You can imagine the feelings that were probably inside her when she was hearing the things that God was saying, and she was watching the special attention that her younger brother was getting. The Jewish Publication Society also notes in this story that prophecy in the ancient Near East, especially in early Arab cultures, was generally a family ordeal. Meaning that if my man Curtis over here had the gift of prophecy in the ancient Near East, all of his sisters and brothers and parents and family members would also be considered prophets and prophetesses. They would be considered a prophetic family. But here in this story, God is taking that cultural norm and giving it the boot. I don't care that you're related to Moses. You're not Moses. He is my unique, special prophet. And just because you have the same blood as him doesn't give you any right to me. That's one of the things that God is making a point of in this story. And as I said before, this also probably explains why Aaron is not punished as much as Miriam is when we get to the end of our story this morning. The second red flag is this whole accusation about his wife. Remember, I told you that this story takes place after they leave Egypt, after they get the Ten Commandments. This is years from Moses' birth and beginning of his story, and when he got married. At this point, some rabbis estimate that Moses has been married for 40 years. And now, all of a sudden, somebody has an issue? Freddie, Becky, how long have you guys been married?
59 this summer.
Congratulations. That's awesome. 59 years. So, imagine, Freddie, that you have a friend that's been your friend for 40. And now all of a sudden he says, you know, Freddie, I don't like that Becky. I don't think she's good for you. Now? I've been with her for a long time. Aren't you supposed to do that whole bit at the altar when it's speak now or forever hold your peace? Now you're going to bring this up? 40 years later? You're going to bring up that you don't like my wife? And remember, this is Moses' brother and sister that are saying this. This is a weird accusation at a very strange time. And there has been much debate about who this woman is, because we have a couple problems. One is that the wife is not named in this story, even though Moses' wife does have a name. Earlier on in the book of Exodus, we know that he married a woman named Zipporah. Zipporah is not mentioned by name here. Two is that Zipporah, we know from the book of Exodus, was a Midianite, which is not from Ethiopia or Cush. That is a separate region. So the big question is, who's this woman? Scholars have put forward two theories about who this is. The first theory is that this is Zipporah. This is Zipporah the Midianite. The reason they give for that is because when we look in the Hebrew Bible, especially in Habakkuk 3:7 of all places, Midian and Cush are used in poetic parallel. So the suggestion is that yes, they are two different geographical areas, but maybe the kingdom of Midian had control over the Cush territory. So in that way, she is both a Midianite and a Cushite. Maybe that's how we reconcile that. Another commentator pointed out that this is not so strangely timed when we remember that in Exodus, Moses got married and then almost immediately left his wife behind. Not because he was a bad husband, but because he knew what he was going to go do in Egypt and he didn't want to bring his wife along for that mess. So the plan was, I'm going to go do this whole Exodus thing and then I'll come back and get you. So he gets her back at Sinai, at the place where they get the Ten Commandments. So some commentators point out that this is probably the first time that the Israelites would have met Zipporah. And that's why there's this big delay from when he got married to her to when people are complaining about it. Oh, this foreign wife. Because remember, Jews are supposed to marry within the Jewish family. They're not supposed to be marrying outsiders. But maybe they thought, oh, well, she's back home. He's not going to get her. And then when she comes back and she's in the mix, now they're like, whoa, wait a minute. You have this foreign wife? Maybe that's why they have the problem. So that's one theory. The other theory is that this is not Zipporah and that Zipporah is dead. That Zipporah died off screen and Moses is now marrying a second woman who is from Ethiopia, who is from the Cush region. This would make the geographical issue go away, so that's convenient. But it seems unlikely, because I don't think Moses would start a fire like this and marry a foreigner just to provoke everybody. And why would there be this unnamed wife that we never hear of again, only in Numbers 12? So most rabbis lean towards the first theory than the second, but those are two options that people have picked. But either way, let me challenge you not to lose your mind over that and study that issue too long if you take a personal interest in that, because it's not the point. This is the first and last time this accusation comes up in the entire story of Numbers 12. So who he's married to is really, at this point, irrelevant, because it's not the real issue at hand. Third and finally, another red flag we need to take notice of is that Miriam and Aaron, as I mentioned before, chose to gossip about Moses immediately and didn't go to him. They had this issue with him, and instead of going to him directly or going to God with it, they just started griping amongst the people right off the bat. But I think we need to realize that this is a common defense mechanic that we use. See, we're very critical of people sometimes in the Bible when we read stories, especially when we read about dumb Peter in the Gospels, right? Oh, Peter, you bonehead. Why would you say that? Why would you do that? And then we realize when we start to unpack our own psyche, our own emotions, realize, I have those feelings sometimes too. Sometimes I have my doubts. Sometimes I wonder what I should do with myself. Here, I think, is another great example where we need to stop back and look at the defense mechanics that we use in our life when we have an issue with somebody. I think there are two deeply rooted desires in our life when we have an issue with somebody of why we go to other people first. First and foremost, I think part of that is a righteous thing that's in us. We know that the Bible says to seek wise counsel. So if I have an issue with Bill, maybe it's wise for me to go to talk to somebody else, maybe Pastor Jamie, first, and say, Jamie, I'm wrestling with these feelings. Do you think these are valid? Do you think I'm out of line? That's all well and good. That is wise. That is biblical. In fact, my best friend just so happens to be a counselor. And both of us have kind of transitioned between counseling and pastoral roles in our lives, so we often use each other as sounding boards when we're wrestling with something or dealing with an issue. And one of the awesome things about it is that he is nowhere near here. So if I talk about somebody that's here, he doesn't know him. And if he talks about somebody over there, I don't know him. So there's no bias there. And there's no gossip potential there. But when we have local friends that we like to bounce off of, and we like to sound off them, am I thinking the right thing here? Do I have a valid issue, a valid complaint? How quickly do we cross that fine line from seeking wise counsel to trash talking and gossip? It's a hard line to toe. It's one we all struggle with. I think that's part of what's going on with Aaron and Miriam here. Maybe they went to somebody to bounce it off, and then it just spun out of control. And that's also where we have a responsibility as the listener. To where if we are that sounding board for somebody and they're bouncing off an issue or concern they have and they start getting really hot, that's where we're supposed to say, whoa, I think we've crossed into you sharing what your struggle is to now you're just gossiping and now you're just abusing this person. Maybe you should back up a little bit and calm down. We have a responsibility as the listener there too. The second desire that we have when we go to other people with our issue, rather than the person we have an issue with, I think the second part of that is a darker, more sinful impulse. And that impulse is to raise up a mob. We like when other people are on our team. Right? Think about every awesome battle scene you've seen in movies. It's never one guy saying, all right, I got this. It's a huge army, right? And there's always like a good 2-minute speech to the troops where he rallies them all up and gets them all fired up. Let's do this. Let's get them. We like to do that. We love that. We love when people are on our team, right? Yeah, you're passionate about this too? Yes. And on that darker side, I think what we tell us is that I want to know I'm not crazy, right? I want to know that you agree with me too, that it's not just me that thinks this, right? So part of that is us seeking our own psychological health. But another part of it is falsehood. What's rooted in all that is a lie. And that lie is that truth is dictated by the majority. That if a lot of people say it's true, it's true. If a lot of people tell me that my feelings are valid, they're valid. That is a lie. that is a lie. The amount of people that believe something has no bearing on the truthfulness of that something, does it? You could have 10,000 people out in the parking lot saying the sky is green. That does not make it so. But yet, we all say, yeah, you're right. But we all do this. We all like to go rally the mob, right? You're with me on this too, right? We all agree on this, right? I think part of that is a insecurity in us. Maybe, just maybe, there's a part of us that knows that our argument is trash, that we don't have a good point, that we're not doing the right thing. But if we get enough people to surround us, it'll feel like it is. All of that is a lie, and it's a temptation from the evil one. It's one of Satan's best weapons to destroy a relationship, is when you start involving others unnecessarily in your issue with another person. That's how it all starts. Then we get to the end of verse 2. We haven't even got past verse 2 yet, guys. There's this much packed in here. At the end of verse 2, it says, the Lord hears it. He's heard all the grumbling, all the complaining, all the gossip. I want you to think back to the last time that you had a darker, impure thought about somebody else. And just picture in that moment as you're, oh, that Dylan, you're grinding my gears this week. And just picture that God, right as you're having that thought, you hear God saying, I heard that. That's what's happening here. Miriam and Aaron are grumbling amongst the Israelites. Oh, that dumb Moses. He thinks he's so cool. And verse 2 says, God heard it. Now, verse 3 is weird. It's really weird. Because as some of you know, tradition holds that the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, were written by who? Moses. Right? Moses is the author. Okay? Remember that. And now look at verse 3. Now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. Sounds like a humble guy. Now, in my Bible, I have parentheses on that. And hopefully yours does too. If not, it should. Okay? This is a great example. I don't have time to go into this in depth today, but we will in diving points. This is a great example of editing in the Old Testament. The Old Testament is not the New Testament. In the New Testament, when we have parentheses like this, they're usually taken out and put in a footnote. And you'll see some footnote in your Bible that says, some manuscripts have this parenthetical note. And we take that out because the New Testament was mail. It was a letter written by somebody for somebody else. So if it wasn't that guy's words and some editor wrote something in, we take it out and say, an editor put this in, but it's not part of the original. In the Old Testament, opposite mechanic. In the Old Testament, it's not somebody's mail. In the Old Testament, it is a prepared book that goes through years of preparation, oral tradition, editing, and finally publishing. And so sometimes we do have these little editor's notes. And this, if you have a problem with this and you're saying, oh, did Moses write that? You're going to have an even bigger problem with Deuteronomy. Because Deuteronomy ends with Moses' death. So unless Moses is barely alive and just saying, Moses breathed his last and he's writing his own death story, or he's foretelling it like a prophet, it's very unlikely that he wrote that chapter. Just like it's extremely unlikely that he wrote this verse, the most humble man on the face of the earth. You think the humble guy would say that of himself? And so it is probably the case here, what most rabbis and Christians have held, is that this is Joshua, because Joshua took up the torch next and wrote the next book, and it kind of picks up right where Deuteronomy left off. Or it's somebody in that circle that they trusted to write these things down, that an editor later said, it's important that you know in this story that Moses is a humble guy. Now, why did the editor put that in? Why did the editor put in this note that you got to realize that Moses is a humble man? I think it's because if you were reading this story and you're watching this guy just take all this bashing, there's probably a part of you that wonders, why doesn't he speak up and defend himself and say something? And I think that's what verse 3 is. Verse 3 is telling us Moses is a humble guy. He's letting all this gossip go because he is a humble guy. He's just going to take it. He's not a guy that responds out of passion or gets into it. So we need to remember that about him. He is humble and he's just keeping quiet. And that's part of how God has wired him. But for in today's world, we often teach that silence implies guilt. Right? Like if someone is on trial or being interviewed and they plead the fifth, almost always, oh, he did it. Oh, she did it. If she didn't do it, or if he didn't do it, he would just answer the questions. He would just give the answers. If he's silent, he's guilty. If he runs, he's guilty. But sometimes silence is a valid option. Sometimes silence allows the other person to just be heard and get it off their chest and allow you to listen and process. And what we're also going to see here is that by listening and not opening our mouth right away, when issues like this stir up, sometimes we allow God to come in and defend us better than we would defend ourselves. And so what we see in the very next verses is exactly that. In verses 4 through 9, we have the Lord's first response. So let's look at those verses now. Verse 4 through 9. At once, the Lord said to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, come out of the tent of meeting, all three of you. And so the three of them went out. Then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud, and he stood at the entrance to the tent and summoned Aaron and Miriam. When the two of them stepped forward, he said, listen to my words. When there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, reveal myself to them in visions. I speak to them in dreams. But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And then the anger of the Lord burned against them, and he left them. Put yourself in Aaron or Miriam's shoes. You have just got done sinning. You've been grumbling against Moses behind his back to the people. God hears it. And then, we didn't think he's hearing it, right? That's why we sin in the first place. We don't think God sees it. If we knew instinctively that God saw everything we do, we wouldn't do the sin that we do, right? We like to fool ourselves into thinking that God's behind a lead door and he can't see what we're doing or hear what we're doing, and we can hopefully get away with our sin. But he heard it. They know that now. And right after this grumbling starts, this problem starts, pillar of cloud, boom, comes crashing down, and God comes out of it and says, get over here, Aaron and Miriam, we need to talk. Now, back in our school days, this is when the principal called. Okay? Collin, come to the principal's office. Everybody else said, ooh, he's in trouble. That's what's happening right here. God came down in a pillar of cloud, guys. That's not is that God? It's obviously a giant pillar of cloud. That's the Lord. Everybody saw it, okay? The whole tent of Israel sees that God has descended down. It's not the first time he's done it. He's led them through the wilderness by a pillar of cloud and by a pillar of fire. Here the pillar of cloud's down again. Well, there's God. And all of a sudden they hear from it, Aaron, Miriam, get over here. Ooh, they're in trouble. So, picture Aaron and Miriam at this point. Uh-oh. God's calling me to the mat. So they come. And notice that God cuts right to the chase, doesn't he? He immediately says, listen, this is how I'm like with some prophets, but with Moses, this is my relationship with him. Do you notice how no more we hear anything about his Cushite wife? The whole initial reason that they were bringing up their complaint? God knows that was all smokescreen, and that's not what the real issue is. He cuts right to the chase. Listen, you want to know about my relationship with Moses? Here it is. I speak to him face to face, clearly and not in riddles. He's my guy. And as he's giving this speech, we hear the Spirit of Christ in it in two very obvious ways. The first example of a Christ-like saying here is when he says that he speaks to Moses clearly and not in riddles. That's a major theme of discipleship in the Gospels. Jesus often taught in riddles, in parables. And when he did, he would go later and explain plainly what he was saying to his disciples. And they would ask the obvious question, hey, if you got to explain it, why are you teaching it in this way? Why don't you just teach it plainly? And Jesus said, you need to have ears to hear and eyes to see. True disciples will hear him plainly. But to those who keep him on the outside, it'll sound like riddles. It'll sound like confusion. Moses is a true disciple of God, who God speaks to clearly. The second Christism here is when he pierces the soul of the sinner with one simple question. You ever notice that as you read the Gospels? Jesus oftentimes can cut right to the chase and right to the heart of something with one question. Why do you do this? Why is this how you responded? And all of a sudden the person just melts before him and realizes, oh, man. God does the same thing here. He gives a little bit of a speech, some statements, but did you notice the question he ends with? He ends with a question. He ends with asking them, knowing who this guy is, knowing that Moses is my main man and I only deal with him in this special way and no one else. Why were you not more afraid to talk bad about him? Think about that. Why, sometimes when we sin, why are we so cavalier about sinning against those who know God, those who are close to him? Do we not think that he will protect them? Did they not think that the pillar of cloud would come as they started to discredit Moses and bash him and make fun of his wife and grumble about who he is? The pillar of cloud comes. God's question is, you didn't think this would happen? This is my main guy, and you're bashing him. You don't think I'm going to step up and defend him? God then literally and symbolically leaves Aaron and Miriam. The wages of sin is what? Death. Death is a separation of the spirit from the body, and spiritual death is a spiritual separation from God. Here, God does it literally. He leaves their presence. They are dead to him at the moment. How could you do this? And this now breaks Miriam and Aaron's relationship with God. He's so angry he can't even look at them, so he leaves. But then we see that there's more consequences in the next verses. Let's look at verses 10 through 13. When the cloud lifted from above the tent, Miriam's skin was leprous. It became as white as snow. Aaron turned toward her and saw that she had a defiling skin disease. And he said to Moses, "Please, my Lord, I ask that you not hold this sin against us that we have so foolishly committed. Do not let her be like a stillborn child, coming from its mother's womb with its flesh half eaten away." And so Moses cried out to the Lord, "Please, God, heal her." This is a powerful, powerful story. And this is by far the most powerful scene in it. Okay? Miriam is punished with leprosy. Leprosy is fatal. It is gross. Honestly, it's a skin-defiling disease. Your body just kind of melts away and your body shuts down. It is lifelong and it is fatal. And that's what Miriam is punished with. And there are some who like to take a poetic parallel here about racism. Because, as the passage says, Moses' wife is a Cushite. So some point out that she might have been dark-skinned. And here there's a poetic parallel. Oh, you got a problem with dark-skinned people? Well, now you're going to be white, real white. You're going to be leprous. That might be what's happening here. I think there's greater poetry happening above that. But some scholars point out that this kind of racism wasn't really prevalent in the ancient Near East, so it's unlikely. But it would be interesting. It is possible, but maybe not likely. But there are even greater parallels to what's going on here. What was Miriam trying to do? She was trying to alienate Moses from the camp. She was trying to wrestle everybody around her and say, let's get this guy out. What happened to her? Now she's a leper, and she's out. Poetic parallel. Moses is silent in humility through the story and just listening. Notice that Miriam hasn't spoken either. Miriam is silent in shame for what she did. Aaron then speaks up, comes alongside her as the brother, and he immediately repents. That's an important thing to notice here. God does not forgive without repentance. Aaron immediately says, we messed up. We sinned. We were wrong. And notice he also immediately puts himself back under Moses where he belongs. And he calls him Lord. Not Lord with a capital L. Okay? There's only one God. But he says, please, my Lord, my master, please ask God to heal us. Notice how immediately he put himself in the right place. He doesn't go to God directly. He knows that he can't do that. He's got to seek Moses to do that for him. He immediately submits himself back under Moses. And now again, I want you to stop again. And I want you to put yourself in the shoes of these characters. Put yourself in Moses' shoes this time. Your enemy, who's been gossiping about you and ruining your reputation amongst the people and making fun of your wife, is now at your feet, leprous, embarrassed by God. And they're saying, please, have mercy. Let's be honest, okay? I'll be honest. If this was me, and one of my enemies was before my feet like this, my initial reaction might not be as kind as Moses's. There are some of us here that might be like, delicious. My enemy is before me, covered in leprosy, and they're getting what they deserve. Good. There are some of us, and this is more like I am, for me, God has wired me very intensely, even as a child, to be very law-oriented. I almost became a lawyer before I became a pastor. I'm very into consequences, and people need to learn their lesson. So for me, I would see that, and I would say, good. This is their just deserts. This is their punishment for their sin. Let her be a leper and learn her lesson. I would not be thinking that they need to be healed. I would be thinking, no, this is what they get for doing this. This is the punishment. Not Moses. Moses is extremely humble and extremely gracious. And Moses, think about that moment. Okay? Think about it from Aaron's perspective now. You've just begged your brother, who you wronged horribly, to ask God to take your consequences away, to let you get off. You're waiting. You're waiting as your brother who you've hurt has been silent this whole story. You're waiting for him to open his mouth, and he does, and you're probably expecting, forget you. And instead, you hear, please, God, heal my sister. Gives me chills. That's powerful. She was 100% wrong. 100%. We love in today's world to do percentages. Oh, maybe I'm 10% wrong. Maybe I was 20% wrong in this. This is 100-0. Moses did nothing wrong. She is 100% wrong. And Moses says, please heal her. Powerful. Powerful. Then we have God speak up again for the last time in the final verses of our story this morning. This is verses 14 through 16. The Lord replies to Moses, if her father had spit in her face, would she not have been in disgrace for 7 days? Confine her outside the camp for 7 days. After that, she can be brought back. So Miriam was confined outside the camp for 7 days, and the people did not move on till she was brought back. And after that, the people left Hazeroth and encamped in the desert of Paran. The end. So Moses asks God, please heal my sister. And God cites the law and says, listen, for way less than what she did. The punishment's at least a week of being outside the camp. So God says she's at least getting a week. She's not getting off scot-free. She's at least getting a week. And so she does. It's a small lesson, but a lesson she must learn nonetheless. And she has to live with leprosy outside the camp for 7 days. That's enough time for everybody to see her and everybody to know what happened. Even if they didn't recognize the giant thunderous pillar of smoke that came down in the beginning of this story. They are now going to see the result. The one who grumbled against Moses has her hand withering away outside the camp for a week. But if you haven't seen the grace of God in this story, let me make it clear for you now. Leprosy was a lifetime disease that ate you away. This is the most gracious thing that God can do by giving her only 7 days, and then she comes back. The only way you can come back to the camp from leprosy is if you are healed. Not if you get a status quo with your symptoms. You have to be clean. No leprosy. This is why it's so miraculous when Jesus heals people of their leprosy in the Gospels, because it's something that doesn't happen. People don't heal from leprosy in this story. God is telling us that she is going to walk back into that camp a week from now, clean, with the leprosy no more. That's a miracle. That is the grace of God. But notice as well that the entire camp suffered. The Israelites have been on the run and surrounded by enemies through the wilderness as they're trying to get to the promised land. And now, because of Miriam and Aaron, they all need to wait like sitting ducks for a week. Imagine the tension that builds. Imagine the stress that would start to come up. Imagine the resentment that some of the people might have towards those individuals. We can't move because of these two dum-dums and what they did. We're stuck here for a week. But they were also loyal. They had fidelity to the ones that were in sin in their camp. They stayed with them while they repented and while they recovered from their sin. And when they were done repenting and when they were done serving their time, they were welcomed back into the camp and they moved along. And guys, that's an important thing we need to hear this morning. Sometimes when people sin against us, we punish them with lifelong leprosy. You are never welcome back in my house, back in my faith, back in my circle, back in my family ever again. But that is not what God teaches. God teaches grace and forgiveness that knows no end. We need to be willing to let even the worst of us, even the darkest of sinners, come back into the fold. So long as that they repent. They have to repent. But once they serve their time, they serve their time. And then we must accept that and welcome them back in, remembering that we were outside the camp too. We were all sinners when Christ died for us. None of us deserved the kingdom. None of us deserved being in the camp. We were all given grace and mercy, and we must extend that to others when we fall short. So what do we take away? Maybe some of you already have some things that are on your brain now that you're going to walk away from this morning. Good. But maybe for some of you, you're thinking, this is an Old Testament story that happened 2,000 years ago. What does it have to do with me? Let me give you 7 concrete things that I think we can walk away from this morning when we deal with conflict in our lives. First of all, I think we need to watch ourselves when we take issue with somebody. The moment that somebody grinds our gears, the moment that somebody upsets us, we need to be on alert. Wait, stop, think. And we need to remember those 2 things I talked about that we can get into. We need to be careful about how seeking wise counsel can turn into gossip. We need to be careful about raising up a mob. We need to watch out for that. We also would do very well to go to the person directly with our issue. Why is that such a lost art in today's world? Why is it that every time we have an issue with somebody, we go immediately to someone else? I'm a young guy, but I've been doing church work since I was 16. And I can tell you that the number one thing that a pastor has to tell somebody is go to the person that you have an issue with. Why are you talking to me? So many times somebody comes into a pastor's office and says, oh, pastor, Can't believe what so-and-so is doing. And the good and godly response is, why are you talking to me? Go talk to them about it. Go make it right. We need to do that in our lives. We need to hold ourselves accountable in that way. Second, we need to keep a cool head when accusations come. My dad is a guy with a short fuse, and I inherited that from him. It doesn't take much to set me off sometimes, and that's one of the things I have to work on in my life. But this is a problem we all have, especially when someone says something that is so incredibly false about you. Accusations can destroy a career on their own, can't they? We've seen it in the news every week. We watch as all these different Hollywood stars fall one by one. And some of them, yes, are guilty. But others are losing their jobs and careers before they even open their mouth, just because someone else has accused them of it. Accusations can destroy a pastor. All it takes is one person to say that I'm doing something I shouldn't be doing at youth group, and that's it for me. It can be very tempting to hear the accusation and get furious, frustrated, and angry. But remember that silence is a valid option. It was the best option in this story. Moses was quiet, he let God do the work, and he let the other people get the things off their chests so that the real issue could rise to the surface. Related to that is my third observation this morning, and that is that we need to let God have our back. So many times we think that we're alone in the car, and that God's kind of hovering out here, and he might come in and help, he might not. God will back you up. In this story, this is like the best backup. This is thunderous pillar of cloud right into the camp, right? Could you ask for more? But other times it's not. Other times God lets you sit for a little bit. This is a big theme in the Psalter, in the book of Psalms. David is sitting there stewing. God, why am I going through this? When are you going to come have my back? This is another theme in Revelation. The saints are waiting for their vindication. They're saying, how long, Lord? How long until you're going to come back us up? But guys, he always does. At the best time, in the best way. He never has forsaken us. He never has left someone behind. He will always vindicate us, sometimes in this life and sometimes in the next when we are glorified and he judges the world. He will always have your back. Fourth, we need to be very careful when critiquing those who are close to God, whether that's a pastor, a deacon, a disciple, anyone. Someone who is close to God like Moses was in this story. We need to be very careful about speaking ill of them and critiquing them, knowing that if we're wrong or if we have malicious intent, the one that they serve is coming for you. You need to be very careful when we whisper gossip about our brothers and sisters in the flock, because God is the judge, and he hears it. Remember the end of verse 2. They're grumbling. God heard it. Heard that, and he holds them accountable to it. Fifth, we need to remember that even as Christians, we're going to be disciplined. Paul asked the question in Romans. He said, should we continue to sin so that grace may abound? So that God can just keep pouring on grace and love and forgiveness? We just keep on sinning so we get more of that? No, obviously not. That's not the point. Thanks, God, for doing all this for me. I'm going to keep doing what you tell me not to do. That's not the response that we should have. We need to realize that just because we are part of his chosen people does not mean that when we sin, we're not going to get punished for it. Maybe we'll get a lighter sentence like Miriam did, but the sentence will still be delivered. Moses asked for her to be healed, and God said, no. She will serve her time. It will be less, but she will serve her time. We need to remember that when we sin. We will be punished. It might not be as severe as some of the examples we see in the Bible, but the punishment will come. And we would do well to be wise and take the punishment and realize that that is love. We've all been kids, and there's some kids here this morning. When our parents give us punishments, it sucks. We don't like it, right? We don't like having our stuff taken away or having restricted access to things, but we realize at the end of the day, we do that because we love, because we want the person to be better. If Miriam didn't have anything happen because of this, she probably wouldn't have learned her lesson. That's the reality at hand. We are disciplined out of love so that we can be better citizens of the kingdom and so that we can affect other people around us in a positive way. Sixth, we need to recognize the grace that has showered this scene. Grace has been from start to finish in this story. I realize it's intense. I realize there's leprosy in this story, okay? But from beginning to end, this could have been so much worse. God could have struck Aaron and Miriam dead, just like he did all the other rebels. He did. Okay? Miriam could have been humiliated by Moses. Moses could have spoken up in the beginning and lashed out at him and reacted harshly. He didn't. When asked by Aaron to ask God for forgiveness and healing, Moses could have said, "Forget you, you deserve this." But instead he said, "Please God, heal her." Miriam could have had leprosy for life, like all the other lepers, and she got it for a week. The Israelites could have left her behind. "You caused all this trouble, you're not worth it." They didn't. This is the kingdom that we're called to live in. This is the kingdom that Jamie and I keep preaching about and that the Bible shouts at you. This is the world we're called to live in. One that is showered by grace, showered by love, showered by forgiveness and mercy. Every time, even when we deserve this justice, we let God have it and we give more and more grace and watch the cool things that come from that. The awesome testimony and transformations that come from that. This is the kingdom we're called for. It's tough. I admitted before, I would not be that guy necessarily when I was in Moses' shoes to say, "Please heal this woman that just ruined my life for the last couple days." But that's what we're called to do. We have to be better. We have to try harder. We have to follow Jesus' example and Moses' in this story. And seventh and finally, and this is the big one. If you walk away with nothing else this morning, hear this. Remember I told you, verse 1 was very important because it had nothing to do with the rest of the story, did it? This man, look at who he's married. That never comes up again in the rest of the story. So my seventh observation and final one this morning is you need to ask, and I need to ask at all times, when someone comes to us with a problem, is this really what the problem is? As Jamie shared before, Jesus told us that we need to be as innocent as doves and as shrewd as serpents. We need to be cunning. Silence, like Moses chose, is helpful in this. When someone comes up to you, "Rebecca, I've got this problem with you." Wait and discern. I don't know why we're messed up people, but we love to not throw the reason that we're mad at somebody. We love to hide it under something else. And the real issue's over here, and we're saying it's this, and it's really this. And for those of us who have been in dating relationships or married, we know exactly what that's all about, don't we? Right? I thought it was this problem. No. I really had this problem. It's a tough battle. It requires discernment, and it requires patience. Their problem in this story, the real issue, was not who Moses' spouse was. It was that deep down, they were jealous that Moses had more attention from God than them. We need to be ready sometimes for the issue that seems to be the issue is not actually the issue. And we need to be willing to let it go. Right? Moses doesn't come back and say, "Well, what about the stuff about my wife you were saying? What's that all about?" He lets it go. God doesn't even address it because it's not the real issue. We need to be shrewd as serpents. We need to be discerning. We need to see through the layers and do our best to psychoanalyze the situation and realize maybe this is not what the problem is. Maybe there's something deeper going on that we need to address. We need to be patient and gracious as we sift through that as well. So as the injured party, when we have an issue, let's be honest. Let's go to someone and say, "This is my problem. Like, this is what I have a problem with you on." Don't throw the smoke screens. Don't waste people's time. Just go to them and say, "This is what I have a problem with." And just be honest. Can you imagine if Miriam just came up to the story and said, "Moses, I'm jealous of the fact that you're closer to God." Then they would have had a good conversation. There would be no need for leprosy or a pillar of cloud or anything like that, would there? And as the party that is accused, as I said before, we need to be cunning and perceptive and gently try to see through the surface. So, let's learn from this story. Let's realize that at any point in our life, we are all Moses in this story sometimes. We have all been Aaron in this story sometimes, and we have all been Miriam in this story sometimes in our lives. Let's recognize that and realize what the responsibilities we have when we have our relationships with one another and conflict with one another, what this story is telling us to do and avoid. Realizing we've been one of these people, and let's do our best to avoid the leprosy, shall we? Let's close with prayer.